for people that might not have been following this as closely as you, what is the Remain in Mexico policy exactly?
It's actually pretty self-explanatory given that name, and that's sort of the informal name for the policy. The administration has its own term, which is called the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a pretty ironic name once you dig into what the policy actually does. So in December of 2018, then Homeland Security Secretary Kirsten Nielsen, sort of out of the blue, somewhat, in a committee announced this policy that really dramatically changes US immigration policy, in particular asylum. And what this policy does is it essentially says, um, under US law, migrants who come to the border, however they come to the border, who are physically there, whether at a port of entry, an official entry point, or between ports of entry, they have the right to seek asylum. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to get it necessarily, and actually very few do, but they have the right to seek asylum. And every other administration, really, the practice has been to allow people to wait inside the United States, where most of them already are, in order to see that process through while their asylum claim is adjudicated. And that often takes quite a long time because there's a immense backlog in the immigration courts. But what this policy did is it forced those people back to Mexico. It forced them to wait in Mexico, in border towns along the U.S.-Mexico border, but border towns in Mexico, through the duration of that process. And at this stage, depending on sort of whose estimates you use, even the Department of Homeland Security says that it's about 60,000 people who went in, who became part of this program and were forced back to Mexico. And that's just since it was begun to be implemented around in late January of 2019. So it's still ongoing.
So what are the conditions like in those border towns for the migrants?
Not great is
Yeah.
the short version. I mean, basically, the system was not set up for this. Mexico wasn't prepared for it. At first, they denied that they had agreed to this policy, and then they stated very explicitly that they did not agree, that this was unilaterally imposed by the United States. And Kirsten Nielsen said herself that it was unilaterally being imposed by the United States. But Mexico actually ends up taking the brunt of it, because these are migrants being sent back to Mexico who are, in most cases, although it was expanded further, they're not Mexican, they're Central American migrants. And the Trump administration had sort of floated in one of its first executive orders that they were going to push essentially all migrants back to Mexico. But there are agreements in place, there are laws in place that state, and Mexico disputed it then, saying we don't have to take people who are not our citizens. So Mexico was not set up to handle this, especially tens of thousands of people. And then you have to combine that with the thousands of people who were already waiting at ports of entry because of this policy referred to as metering, which was essentially the Trump administration just not letting people in who were trying to come to ports of entry and make a claim. So you've got tens of thousands of people essentially sort of backed up in border cities, many of which don't have an infrastructure. They might have a few shelters that are mostly run by churches, not run by the government, run by nonprofits. So a lot of people essentially were on the streets in some of the most dangerous cities in the world, according to our own government. And so these sort of de facto impromptu refugee camps have popped up along the border. And while reduced in size, now many of them still exist. And there are basically no resources. And US officials stated explicitly that basically once they were pushed back to Mexico, it wasn't their problem.